There are few places where MBTA commuter rail lines connect with each other outside of downtown, but this unique, history-rich line is one of the few places where they do. Come along as I explore the Wildcat Branch. If you look at a map of the MBTA commuter rail, every line seems to follow a similar pattern. Each originates in one of two downtown terminals, and each goes to separate suburban areas with very little interconnectivity between lines. Besides lines which only see freight traffic, there are only a few places where commuter rail lines connect with each other outside of downtown. The most obvious of these is Reedville, a two-level station where the Northeast Corridor, Fairmount Line, and Franklin Branch all meet. Another is the Framingham Secondary, where MBTA trains run between Walpole on the Franklin Line and Mansfield on the Providence Line. However, passenger service only regularly runs between Walpole and Foxborough, with the section between Mansfield and Foxborough only being used by special event trains to Gillette Stadium. However, there is one more connection between the outer sections of commuter rail lines, which will be the subject of today's video. That line is the Wildcat Branch, connecting the Lowell Line and Haverhill Line. The Boston and Lowell Railroad opened between Boston and Lowell in 1835, stopping at Wilmington along the way. The Andover and Wilmington Railroad constructed a single-track branch from Wilmington to Andover, completed in 1836. This was the line that would eventually become the Wildcat Branch as we know it today. The line became part of the Boston and Maine Railroad, which reached Portland, Maine by 1843. However, the Boston and Maine still had to use Boston and Lowell Railroad controlled tracks to reach Boston. The Boston and Maine did not want to have to use a competing railroad's trackage in order to reach a city as significant as Boston, since their trains were at the mercy of the Boston and Lowell's timetable and often had to wait for extended periods of time before entering their territory. As a result, the western route was built to Boston via Reading in 1845, splitting off from the original route at Wilmington Junction. Since the Boston and Maine had no more use for it, the line from Wilmington Junction to Wilmington Station was transferred to the Boston and Lowell, who operated it for 3 years before abandoning it in 1848, making this line technically the first railroad to ever be abandoned in all of New England. The Andover and Wilmington sat in abandonment until 1874, when the Boston and Lowell decided to give it a second life by rebuilding the line. Their intention was to gain full control of routes from Lowell to Boston. At Wilmington Junction, its track ran alongside the Boston and Maine Western route instead of merging with it. After a new station at Wilmington Junction, the line turned west and headed to Lowell via the Lowell and Lawrence Railroad. This gave the Boston and Lowell Railroad a second route to Lowell and essentially blocked the Boston and Maine from using the Lowell and Lawrence trackage to reach Lowell itself. The two separate routes can still be seen today, with the Wildcat Branch running alongside the Haverhill line for about half a mile before they actually joined together. Anyways, the Boston and Lowell was purchased by the Boston and Maine in 1902, leaving all of these lines under the control of just the Boston and Maine. In 1959, the Boston and Maine Railroad introduced a number of service changes. This included the abandonment of the western route between Reading and Wilmington Junction, with North Wilmington Station being closed. Train service on the western route only ran between Boston and Reading, and all service to Haverhill went via the Lowell Line and Wildcat Branch. To replace the closed North Wilmington Station, Salem Street Station was constructed, which was the first and only station to ever be built on the Wildcat Branch. In 1965, the MBTA began funding commuter service on the Boston and Maine network. Their funding district only reached Reading and Wilmington. As a result, Salem Street Station was abandoned in 1967, and only one round trip per day ran to Haverhill. In 1976, the MBTA officially purchased many Boston and Maine lines, including the Wildcat Branch. The line between Reading and Wilmington Junction was restored, once again giving trains two options to go from Haverhill and points north to Boston. Today, Almost all MBTA Haverhill Line commuter rail service goes via the western route, except for two weekday trains, one inbound in the morning, which makes all local stops from Haverhill to Ballardville, before taking the Wildcat Branch and Lowell line into Boston without making any more stops, and one evening outbound train which does the same route in reverse. In addition, Amtrak Downeaster trains to Maine, which began operation in 2001, always take the Lowell line and the Wildcat Branch in order to have trains stop at Anderson-Woburn. CSX freight trains L055 and L065 usually take the Wildcat Branch and Lowell line into Boston to avoid the steep grade at the Mystic River Bridge on the Haverhill line. Train L059 sometimes uses the Wildcat Branch to reach customers in Woburn. Today, the Wildcat Branch provides operational flexibility for the MBTA and Amtrak, allowing trains from Haverhill and points further north to have two different ways into Boston. For example, when the MBTA shut down a section of the inner Haverhill line to accommodate construction, trains could still serve the outer Haverhill line by going via the Lowell line and the Wildcat Branch. During track work between Woburn and Boston, Amtrak Downeaster trains could still go to Boston via the inner Haverhill line, albeit missing a stop at Anderson-Woburn. In fact, even outside of service disruptions, some Amtrak equipment moves still use the Haverhill line all the way into Boston because it allows them to continue straight onto the Grand Junction branch without reversing direction. You might be wondering, how did the Wildcat Branch get its name? What does a wildcat have to do with a railroad line? Well, as it turns out, the entire line is within the town of Wilmington, so it was named after the Wilmington High School's mascot, which is a wildcat. Now, I will show you around all the railroad crossings on the branch, starting at Wilmington Station. This is Wilmington Station, a rather standard station for the MBTA. However, right here next to the outbound platform, this is the switch where the Wildcat Branch branches off, heading to the right. Right after splitting off from the Lowell line, the line crosses Main Street. This is the first of 4 grade crossings on the Wildcat Branch. Heading north, the next crossing is Clark Street, a rather standard railroad crossing. Now I'm at Glen Road, which, like the last crossing, is a pretty standard crossing, although it does feature some neat mechanical bells. I will be staying here for Haverhill Line Train 218, which is the morning inbound express, which takes the Wildcat Branch and the Lowell line to get to Boston. Now we've arrived at the 4th, final, and most interesting crossing on the Wildcat Branch. Like the previous crossing at Glen Road, Salem Street also features mechanical bells. Salem Street is also the site of the former Salem Street Station. Despite only having been used for 8 years from 1959 to 1967, the platform at Salem Street Station still exists. This crossing is also near Wilmington Junction. You can see it's kind of hard to see in my video, but the signals over there are for Wilmington Junction, where the Wildcat Branch merges with the Haverhill line. This is the other Salem Street crossing on the western route, or the MBTA Haverhill line. Just down there is North Wilmington Station. That's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history and the importance of the MBTA's Wildcat Branch. Before you go, however, I'd like to remind everyone that my Q&A forum is still open to responses and will be open until Thursday, January 15th. So if you'd like to submit a question for me, feel free to do so. The video request form is also open to responses, and both are linked in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.